The philosophical effects of World War One, and there were many. The One of the things that we have to remember about the Great War that would have been intensely jarring for anybody who lived through the period was that people were able to see the carnage of war in many cases for the first time. I mean, photography had been around since the Civil War, and certainly the Spanish-American War had been photographed, but American audiences and indeed global audiences were not really prepared for the photography that would come out of World War One. The amount of firepower that went into World War One, the number of civilians who were killed, and just the power of the technologies that went into World War One, and also the ways in which they killed. There was chemical warfare. Explosives were much more powerful. In fact, many of these explosives had been stockpiled for years and had not been used. And so the amount of explosives that were available for use and were, even the armies were not prepared for the power that they had. And this resulted in an immense amount of death. And it also resulted in those who were wounded in some way, in some ways beyond recognition, and in some ways beyond repair. Also another aspect of the Great War, which we have to remember, that would have profoundly affected people, was the aerial aspect of World War One. There was no war previously in which airplanes had been used. I mean, these were rather simple airplanes by today's standards, but the threat of aerial bombardment really becomes a reality only in the Great War, in which a airplane can deliver a payload or bomb or even surveil the other side. And armies were not prepared really for the advent of aerial technology in that way. The wounded who came home were often shocked, to the extent that not only were they came home sometimes often without limbs, but sometimes blinded by mustard gas and other chemical agents. And this was different in many ways for those people on the home front. I remember also this photography was readily available for anybody who was reading a newspaper, because in newspapers you could also have photographs at this time, which was something that was much more expensive and difficult to do previously. One of the main things about the war that affected people also was just the meaninglessness of it. This affected not only soldiers, but also civilians at home who constantly watched little or no progress being made on these fronts, seeing pictures of soldiers in trenches, and then soldiers who came home said, well, look, we really didn't do anything. There was no real advancement from one trench to the other. And soldiers started to feel this, certainly by the last years of the war, that all of the blood and sacrifice and all of the friends and family that had been lost in the war really perhaps were for nothing. As an example, between February and December of 1916, over 500,000 French soldiers died in combat. That's just between February and December of 1916. Remember, the war goes from 1914 to 1918. And in that same period of time, almost 500,000 German soldiers died during that same time period. That's only French and German soldiers. I'm not even talking about British soldiers. And this is all before the United States even enters the war. You're talking about millions of soldiers killed by these massive technologies. So this created a real sense of despair, not only in soldiers, but also in people on the home front. The technologies that were used also could be fired at such a distance and could be of such power that oftentimes the soldiers who were on the front experienced this sense of meaninglessness because they could never really even see the person who was firing at them. There was nothing in the war that felt immediate and controllable for humans who were stuck in the war. In many cases, there was so much military armament available because of the advances in the late 19th century of industrial production and the mass production of armaments, that there was no real fear of these machines being exhausted. And the use of heavy artillery, which were often commanded and at least ordered to be commanded by distant generals who never really even visited the front or never even really engaged in the really hard combat that was in the trenches, meant that this divide opened up between soldiers and high command. This is typical in a war in which you have dissatisfaction with higher ups, but this became a real problem in almost all armies during World War I, in which generals were seen as those who might be sort of better born or more wealthy and could sort of secure themselves a commission or secure themselves an officer's commission and be far behind the lines out of trouble. So this created a sense, at least in soldiers, of a great deal of psychological alienation and meaninglessness. And this started to feed into the various philosophies about the war, the various theories about the war that come out during and after the war. So let's go over some of the philosophical perspectives on the war, and this is by no means an exhaustive list, but the war really transforms the way that humans look at themselves and look at their environment. Probably in the American context, one of the most clear examples we have of this is what we call the Lost Generation. These are the Lost Generation consists of American artists, many of whom did not live in the United States in the 1920s, artists such as Ernest Hemingway, Gertrude Stein, many of whom exiled themselves really to Paris, and that's where they produced most of their work. They felt in many ways, many of them, such as Hemingway, felt that American society was vapid, that it didn't really understand the horrors of the war. And those who experienced the war, such as many of these artists, and experienced Europe during the war, felt that the United States really had become a place that they didn't understand anymore. So they're often called the Lost Generation. And they express this kind of alienation and meaninglessness in many of their works of literature. That's certainly not the only philosophical perspective, and I'm hesitant to even call this a philosophical perspective, but the perspective of people like Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler, of course, was a German soldier briefly during the Great War. He was supposedly, we believe, blinded by mustard gas, and he came to this kind of vision, or at least he says this in his work Mein Kampf, that he had this vision of what the real problem was with the world while he was wounded. And he really comes out of World War I a kind of somewhat of a broken person, but also with this new kind of mission. He comes up with a theory that the German army, when they actually eventually surrender in 1918, or at least when they eventually sign the armistice, that the soldiers had been stabbed in the back by bureaucrats back in Berlin. That the war should have been prosecuted further. It should have been fought more. That Germany would have won the war eventually if they had just kept going, and that the leadership had kind of sold them out. And then Hitler connects the leadership and those back in Berlin to Jews. He starts to blame Jews in general for the abandonment of the war, and this starts to become Hitler's larger theory about who to blame, not only for the loss in World War I, but to blame for the defeat of Germany in World War I. That all of this had to do with some sort of inner problem in Germany, which he then blames on Jews. So you see, this is another perspective. Again, I'm hesitant to call it philosophy because it's really a melange of hate that Hitler really puts into Mein Kampf. There's no real cohesion to it. Other perspectives that come out of the war, other ideas that come out of the war, is that what caused the war was this balance of power problem, and that many of the peoples who had sort of lived in, say, Austria-Hungary, for example, or in other states to the east, such as in Poland, et cetera, those areas, they should be able to determine their own destiny. They should have their own countries. And so this idea of national self-determination, which is Woodrow Wilson is a big fan of, and he comes to the Versailles Conference saying, well, we should have national self-determination. We should have a line of states, line of buffer states between Germany and Russia that would become states like Czechoslovakia, Romania, Poland, etc. Those people should be able to determine their own destiny. Now, this idea of national self-determination did not extend to, say, colonial peoples in places such as, say, Southeast Asia or in Africa, but at least the idea of national self-determination became a major idea that comes out of the war. Another concept that comes out of the war is that this war was so terrible that it must be, and it was called this afterwards, this must be the war to end all wars. There would never be another war afterwards this brutal, because people had experienced the terror and horror of this particular war. And that perspective, obviously, it was completely naive, given World War II, in which, by some estimates, almost 3 times as many people, 4 times as many people died in World War II. But nevertheless, this idea was that peace must be preserved at all costs. Perhaps one perspective that is one that we can still see today is the rise of science fiction, for example, because one of the things that does occur in the war is this recognition of the smallness of humans in the wake of the technology that they have created. That technology had so overwhelmed humankind during World War I and had made humankind so, in some senses, meaningless, that that the advent of machines had perhaps shown the way towards a new dystopian future in which machines would actually reign. And you see this, for instance, the term robot first comes about after World War I, the idea of a mechanical human, a mechanical man. If you see pictures of World War I soldiers in gas masks, for instance, that image of a human totally encased in sort of an artificial design became one of the major sort of themes of the 1920s and going onward. You see it, for instance, in Fritz Lang's famous movie Metropolis, which came out in 1927. And this, and in the future, pretty much all science fiction in the future, in future decades, sort of harkens back to this post-World War I encounter with the massive and almost inexorable nature of machines. And and that perhaps the future is not human, perhaps the future is in some sense metal. I gave you the example of, for instance, soldiers in gas masks. Well, the idea that in the future, humans would be, instead of just being human, be part human, part machine in one way or another, and that they would be cyborgs. That's the term for a half human, half machine. This is a famous play by called Enter the not called Enter the Robots, but called R.U.R. by Karl Capek, in which you have the first robots appear, and it's where the term really starts to come about. Here's a famous robot, is sort of a female robot created in Fritz Lang's Metropolis, which becomes kind of an iconic image of the 1920s. Turning back to The Lost Generation, I just want to read a couple of quotes by Ernest Hemingway here from not only 1920s, but also 1930s, in which Hemingway is really expressing in these quotes some of his perspective on what it meant to experience that type of war and then come out of it and try to live. They wrote in the old days that it is sweet and fitting to die for one's country, but in modern war, there's nothing sweet nor fitting in your dying. You will die like a dog for no good reason. This kind of belief that there was no that all of the lies that were told to soldiers as they went into war, all this triumphalism, when they come back, there's just nothingness. There's almost sort of just a sea of no meaning. In A Farewell to Arms, written shortly, much closer to World War I, the first quote, by the way, comes from one of his Spanish-American War, not Spanish-American War, his Spanish Civil War essays in the 1930s. The world breaks everyone, and afterward many are strong at the broken places, but those that will not break it kills. It kills the very good and the very gentle and the very brave impartially. If you're in none of these, you can be sure it will kill you too, but there will be no special hurry. And this is not to say that there's no hope coming out of World War I, but a lot of the dark messages that come out of the war, Adolf Hitler, some of the meaninglessness that comes out of the Lost Generations writings, the notion that perhaps the future is metal, these kind of dystopian images are really what, to a certain extent, sets the stage for World War II. In that many of these things are not resolved. Many of this shock is not resolved by World War II. And in fact, it would be people like Hitler and the Nazis who really would kind of glorify war, who felt that their experience in World War I and all of its terror and horror was not something to be rejected, but something to be celebrated. And in fact, that in some historians' estimations, that accounts for the sort of eagerness for Hitler and the Nazi Party to start war, and to start a war that would be much, much worse than World War I.